some reason that really did make me focus.
Kelsey, want some help?
So, for tonight, you know that life on this earth isn't a test, right? Like, contrary to what a lot of people believe, contrary to what a lot of Christians say, our existence here is not actually a test. See, whatever you might believe, even the biblical narrative actually doesn't qualify that idea. When you look at Genesis, God looks at all that he created and he says it's good. He doesn't say good as in this is a good opportunity to test their value and determine whether or not they can have eternal life. No, he says it's good and just leaves it at that. And then even beyond that, once the fall happens and the curses are bestowed as sin has entered into the world, he doesn't say go out and be tested by me as to whether or not I'll keep you. The things that are said are that, go out, the ground will be difficult, life will be difficult, but be fruitful and multiply. Go wrestle this earth down. I don't really understand where Christians get the idea that every aspect of life is a test, because biblically that's not true. There's nothing to actually back that up, aside from a few obscure verses here and there where somebody gives a perspective. The thing
I'm
of
just
it,
curious, have anybody in here heard that said? I guess I've just never heard that.
I've lived it, dude.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I feel like the church I grew up in probably believes that because of other things they said, but I just wanted to know, is it common for them to explicitly teach that?
Yeah, basically, my church was the same way, where this life is like a training ground for heaven. Kind of thing. It's
Oh, weird.
Didn't use those words, but kind
Yeah.
of boiled down the sermon can be boiled down into that, and I'm using evocative language because it's kind of funny, but it was kind of what the point of the sermon was. It's like,
Yeah.
that sounds kind of worthless and kind of shitty.
Yeah. Yeah, it's meant to make you correct your behavior,
It builds character.
or you're
so-
gonna have guilt.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
yeah. So with that said, so the thing about life and the thing about life with God specifically, and it doesn't really matter what you prescribe to. One of the things that we run into in life is the concept of seasons. And I feel like one of the things that needs to be more spoken up about, especially in church, is the concept of the desert season. Now, we describe it in Christian vernacular, we use the term desert season because it's a reference to Scripture. And there are particular points where different people or people groups were called out into the desert by God. Whether it's the Israelites who ended up in the desert for 40 years. It was only supposed to be 40 days, but they chose to stay there. They couldn't follow God when he said, go into your promised land. They got scared by the people there and then chose to continue walking the desert, and they were there for 40 years. And another instance in Galatians, Paul talks about his time when he first met God, when Jesus met him on the road to Damascus, I think it was. Anyway, when Jesus met him and showed him who he was, and then he went and he had the blindness removed and all that other stuff, he then from there went down into the deserts, into Saudi Arabia, and ended up going out and learning how to preach the gospel and so on. And probably the most clear version is out of Matthew 4. When Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. Jesus was called out to the desert, and after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he ended up spending ended up meeting Satan out there and effectively being tempted in a lot of different ways. And the thing of it is that the reason why I think that this is an important thing for people to understand, especially in the church, is to help us kind of note that, there are seasons where trials happen. And there are seasons where God will call you into places of trial. However, that doesn't make it your whole life. On the contrary, we all have seasons of trial, seasons of celebration, seasons of growth, seasons of joy, seasons of despair. Life is a compilation of different seasons that are kind of manifested in one way or the other. But the thing of it is that some of us, we end up having these, what we could call seasons, last for a very, very long time. And the trouble that we run into is when we talk about this, is that there's another side to this too, in that when we talk about a desert season, or a wilderness season is another word for it, or term for it. Effectively what it is a season of trial. And it's not intended to tear somebody down so much as to kind of show somebody for what they really are. When God called people out into the desert or into the wilderness, it was meant to be as a means to help them grow. The intention behind it being that we're going to take you someplace and life is going to be a little harder. Because the truth is that it's really easy to believe that God is always going to provide for you when you're living with your parents and you're growing up in the church and everybody's telling you that, and then suddenly you never actually have to put that to the test in any way, shape, or form. That's the purpose behind this kind of season, is that it removes that, and suddenly you're left with your faith. And whether or not you actually believe that God will take care of you, or if you actually believe that He won't. And it ends up being an important kind of trial period because it tests your actual faith, as opposed to what you can regurgitate or what you say you believe. And the thing of it is more than that, it strips away things that cover, that cover these things, whether it's delusion, pride, arrogance. And I draw a line between pride and arrogance because for the prideful, they'll typically be aware of something like this, that something needs to change, but they don't see why they have to change it, or oftentimes they kind of fall back on the reasons for why they can stay the way they are. Whereas for the arrogant, they're ignorant. They don't know. They just assume that they're right on. They just assume that they have it together. They assume that they've got this stuff. So they'll walk out and blindly into traffic thinking that they're going to be protected. Or in the case of one guy, they'll claim that God has given them dominion over all wildlife and get killed by a tiger.
So arrogance is kind of like refusal to actually look, right?
It's maybe
In the
not
first
even
place.
knowing. Yeah.
Okay.
They don't care to look into it. I think that ends up being the problem that a lot of Christians have when called out into these deserts, is that they're arrogant. In my experience, most Christians, especially ones who have been raised in church, are very, very arrogant. And, God doesn't really have an appreciation for that. So he calls people out to these places to be tested. And it's like, okay, you claim to believe this, you'll beat other people down with your Bible saying that you believe this, but when push comes to shove, do you actually believe it? No, I didn't think so.
Does it
Okay.
actually connect to your heart?
Right. So the purpose of this season is to kind of test and draw this stuff out, and even to bring revelation, to kind of help us see the truth of who we are and the truth of what we actually believe, and even to grow from there.
Mm-hmm.
Because the purpose is not to say, okay, this is the issue with you. and then leave it at that. It's always intended to be an issue of, okay, this is your issue, now let's grow from here. Because the purpose behind the season is, again, like I said, we call it a desert season because that's what it was for the people in the Bible. They went out into the wilderness or the desert. The reality of it is, though, is it's not a state of desolation, it's a state of revelation and growth. And everybody has to go through them at some point or another, because otherwise they are able to maintain that arrogance or ignorance or all these different things. There are a lot of issues that we run into with this. But kind of like laying out the explanation for what this is, the first thing that I feel like I was supposed to talk about was the flip side of that, about those really long desert seasons, or when people believe that they've been given up on by God or by revelation, or where they just believe he's left them and abandoned them. And the thing of it is that the point behind a lot of this season in particular is, again, God will pull back a little bit, usually. Like, usually he won't talk as much, he won't involve himself as much, because it is kind of a test. It's like, okay, we've built this ship, we're going to put it on the water and push it out to sea, and let's see if it sails. And if it doesn't, he'll pull it back and everything. But the problem that we run into as people is that we're not always willing to come back to shore. Whoops. Anyway, so that ends up being like the big thing, is that there are a lot of people who what they end up doing is they make a home in the desert. And that's not to say the ones who end up in a quote-unquote desert season because they make a bunch of bad choices. The truth of the matter is that sometimes when we find our lives in like a state of desolation and disarray and pain and anguish and all those different things, there are plenty of times where it's because we chose that. And I don't mean that to say like, God took you into the desert and then you made a home. On the contrary, I mean like, you chose to be a crappy person. And as a result, you have a crappy life. Maybe you didn't even choose to be a crappy person. Maybe you just didn't know how to respond to your own like emotional immaturities. What I mean by that is like, I've seen it where, somebody gets into a state of depression and they start to push everyone in their life away. And as a result of that, they find that they have no one. Now, they've worked really, really hard to push everybody out of their life. They've fought for this. And then when it's all said and done and they find themselves alone, that only feeds into the depression more. But they also aren't able to or willing to accept the responsibility for their decisions. Or when they've made decisions that they knew were going to be destructive, and then they kept doing that, expecting it to be different somehow, or that they were going to control it, or that something was going to be different because this one little aspect, this person was nice to them, or this person was, even though it's been a bad relationship for 10 plus years or something like that, they were nice every time that happened. And there's something to that, the psychology of like an act of kindness and the way that that can lead people on in bad relationships, because it gives them that little glow of hope and then turns it against them. So it's not to say, like, I don't say all this meaning to be harsh or cruel or anything like that. There's grace there. It's just that just because your life is bad doesn't mean that God called you into a season. What it means, we are still capable of making decisions. We're still culpable for the choices that we make. And even in the midst of emotional things or anger or different things like that can become kind of settled on us, how we treat the people around us, how we treat our lives is still on us. And it's still going to be something that we have to be responsible for. I've known some people who, in the church, who they end up doing really bad things. There's one guy who cheated on his wife of like 60 years, and she found out. And
60
then,
years?
yeah. And they got a divorce. And he refused to take responsibility for his decision, and instead chose to continue living this lifestyle of just running around doing things. He's just like, oh, God's got me in a desert. No, he doesn't.
You do.
You did this. Yeah. So, that said, it's really important to recognize, like, that our decisions they matter. The choices that we make matter. And if we make bad choices, we can give ourselves a bad life. That happens, and that's not God's fault. God didn't tell that guy to cheat on his wife. He didn't tell those people with depression to, hey, treat your friends really badly so that they leave you. You know, that wasn't God. That would be completely counter to everything that Jesus actually taught in all those cases. But it's one of those things that we run into where a lot of people who just, they don't want to take responsibility for their choices. They're theirs. But that's kind of like an aside thing. The other side are the really long desert seasons, and what I mean by that is the home, making a home there. The thing about it is that sometimes what happens is, like I said, you know, the idea behind this whole thing is to reveal the truth of where somebody's really at so that we can grow from there. It's not intended to be like, this is your status. You're an unfaithful person. You don't actually believe in God as much as you claim to. That's not supposed to stop there, though. Like in everything that God does, he tries to develop us and build us and propel us forward into a life that's not only with him, but also good. So as a result of that, when a truth like that's revealed, it's not intended to just sit there. It's intended to be moved forward from, to grow from, to build from. But the truth is that some of us, when we're met with that kind of what we might view as criticism, as has been my case in the past, you know, it can become the kind of thing where it's just like, okay, well, that's who I am. And then we just stay there. And we sit with it. And we live with that. There are a lot of people that I've known, and myself included at times, where there are things that, you know, God calls us out into these hard kind of trial places, and when we're met with them, we don't respond well. I can speak for myself in saying that there have been times where I've recognized that this is what God is doing. He's trying to bring change to my life. He's trying to bring revelation. He's trying to bring things like this. However, because this hurt my feelings, I don't want to. I want to sit and be angry because I'm angry. And I'm not going to move forward with this because I'm feeling petty.
Offended.
Yeah. I'm offended, and as a result of that, I get petty or something like that. I'm not the only person in the world that I know who does this. And sometimes it takes different forms, where for myself I can be honest enough about myself and with myself to say that I'm being a little bitch.
Honey, just because I call you that doesn't mean you have to.
Thanks, wife. Anyway, I also know that there are other people where it's very, very different. And from the years of talking to people who have found themselves in this particular space, it can be anywhere from they already had abandonment issues, and then suddenly it's like it triggered those. In some cases, they felt like God he didn't care, or maybe they were just really sensitive to the idea of being criticized because they were already hurt so bad, and it wasn't that it was they were being weak or anything like that. It was simply that they already were covered in like open wounds. It's that kind of thing where it's like if you're covered in a bunch of like gashes and then somebody walks up and flicks you a little bit, you might explode on that person who flicked you a little bit. Even though it didn't really hurt, you're already in so much pain. You're there. You're at your boiling point. I've seen that happen a lot. Other instances are that people will feel like they're, it's a justice thing, and they're justified to stay where they're at or be angry at God in this place. I've done that. So whatever the reason is, and there's more, there are a lot of occasions where we miss the point of what's going on and end up making very human choices. And in that, we find ourselves sitting in this place that we're not really meant to live in. And it can kind of drive us forward into a life of just despair and frustration and anger and betrayal and just a plethora of different emotions that kind of like take root inside of us. And bitterness is enormous. And the thing of it is like I've talked about before, sin, I don't prescribe to the idea that sin is the end-all be-all in terms of like why we do what we do. I don't think that lust, for example, is really the issue when we talk about sin. I think that the real issue tends to be loneliness. I think that a lot of the time any form of sin is driven by emotional need or emotional loss or emotions that have not been learned to be dealt with or different things like that. Because a lot of times that's what drives us forward into the things that are not really okay. And anything that at many points when I've talked to God about this, that's where he's led me. It's just like this person's struggling with, there have been times where like people have come to me and asked me to pray for them for their struggles with pornography as an example. And going to God, he's like, don't pray for their issue with pornography. Pray for their issue with loneliness. Pray for their issue with insecurity. Pray for their issue with fear of women or relationship. There are a lot of different things that he'll call forward where it's addressing kind of the root issue instead of what's at face value, which tends to be what a lot of sin is. It's basically the little kid reacting to their emotions as opposed to being able to say, okay, this is where I'm really at.
So like the lust is more of a symptom of something bigger.
Right, exactly. So being stuck in like this place that we're being stuck in this one season of what feels like desolation, it can really exasperate those parts of us that feel those ways. And the truth is that it doesn't really matter like what you believe. I've seen people who don't prescribe to any belief in God, and the moment that they get caught up in a season of trial and choose to live there, they live there. And they stay there for years. And they'll struggle and feel abandoned and betrayed, and even the idea that even the idea of a life outside of that becomes an illusion. Something that they dream about, something that they pretend about, but something that could never possibly be real. So it becomes this thing where hope kind of gets turned around on us. And that's just kind of the reality that we inevitably end up facing when we choose to stay here, or when we find ourselves staying here. Now, for followers of God, there is a place for us to be able to like grab on to what's there, but again, it's going to mean, seeing what the point was. Why are we here? And kind of the advantage that we have is that we can ask God or we can ask other people to pray for us and find revelation, all these different kind of avenues for God to speak to us and help us see. But it still does require that sometimes, to be able to be free from that kind of place. Otherwise, it just feels like hell. And the truth is that, you know, after being in hell for a while, there's a lot of reality about God that just kind of stops being reality. You start to see him in different lights. I know for myself, for example, one thing that I've been having to face lately is the fact that I don't always view God as a place of comfort. In fact, I generally don't. So if I have something going on inside, I don't want to go talk to him. I kind of want to keep it to myself because I'm afraid of being, you know, having to face that it's my fault or something like that. Because there's a lot that I already feel is my fault. So it's kind of like that exposed nerve kind of syndrome. So as a result of that, like just being transparent, this is something that I find myself, that God's pulling up and drawing my attention to, and it's kind of up to me whether I want to move forward from that or stay here. And the thing that I want to do is move forward. Like, fortunately, I'm not being a little bitch in this occasion, so that's fine. But but it's still one of those things where, you know, in order to get out of these longer desert seasons, sometimes we even have to go back to where it started or why. Otherwise, you know, we'll just live there. And a lot of people do. Yeah, it's a really important story in a lot of ways, the Israelites being led out of Egypt. Moses came in and, you know, effectively God had Moses lead the people of Israel out of Egypt, out of being slaves there, towards a promised land that God had set out for them, which became Israel. The trouble was that they, you know, they didn't really, once they were out in the desert, they were really caught up in what they gave up in Egypt, because the truth is that Egyptian slaves weren't actually treated too badly. You know, it was funny because reading the Bible and like the things that the Israelites would complain about, it never quite made sense with the narrative that was given until more recently, when whatchamacallit, anthropologists, I think, were studying Egyptian remains, and they found contracts that were given to slaves, and they talked about what was given to slaves in terms of, you know, food and housing and different things like that. You know,
Interesting.
they did have a life there, and it wasn't actually all that bad. They were slaves, like they were still slaves.
And it depended on who their master was.
Right. But the point is that when they wandered the desert, they found themselves constantly wanting to go back to Egypt. Even after Israel was established, even after they had their own kingdom, their own place, there were still Israelites who looked back at Egypt as, you know, this kind of like regrettable thing to give up on. They even turned back to some of their old gods and started worshiping those. That's why some of the books in the prophets say what they say, where God's very angrily rebuking the Israelites. The point is, though, is like when you're in the desert and you have something hopeful right in front of you that you've never experienced, that you've never known about, that you might not even believe is real, and you're stuck in this place over here, which is dry and uncomfortable and lacking in water, which is to say lacking in refreshment. You might find yourself looking back at an old life, a life that you had before, and say, man, I wish I had that, because that was a lot nicer than this right here. And in the case of the Israelites, they did that enough to finally have God tell them, okay, here you'll live. So for 40 years, that's where they lived. They stayed in that desert. And it wasn't until they were actually ready to give it up that they were even allowed to go forward. Moses himself didn't actually get to go into that land of Israel. It wasn't until after he died that, and passed the baton off to Joshua, that, that was able to happen. So it ends up being that thing of like, whatever it is that causes us to stand up and say, okay, well, I'm just going to stay right here. It ends up being something that we might have to go back to and look at why this started and where we're really at, and also what it is that God was trying to draw attention to even let us move forward. Because sometimes these things are things that really do stop us from ever having a relationship with Him. And that's just a reality to be stated, because there are things that we don't really see as being bad. You ever hear of like concepts of like faking it till you make it, for example?
Never heard of it.
Really big in the church.
Yeah,
A lot of people don't have genuine relationships with God. They have relationships with the Bible and the amount of work that they do and the things that they do. And even that whole concept, like, you two were talking about with the whole thing of the idea that all of life is a test. Even that becomes its own idiom that people believe, and then as a result of that, it colors their whole idea of who God is and what a relationship looks like. It's not a father and child relationship. It's a
Master and slave.
master and slave. Yeah, that's a better one than I was going to go with. I was going to go CEO and server. It's just like you don't even register. You don't matter. All that matters is your performance, and then you might get a promotion and you might get a star for Employee of the Month, which looks like a raise maybe. It's one of those things where we end up creating a very different interpretation of God from even what He's willing to have. And that's why these things end up being such a big deal. They can be painful, especially when, like, a lot of people were raised in the church where you're being fed this stuff from the time you're just a little tiny person. And at your most early developmental stages, when you're able to just soak everything in, you're being told things that aren't true about God and His character and what He actually wants from you. And now suddenly you mature and God's just like, okay, we're going to peel this thing back because that's not real. And that can create kind of a catastrophe in our own minds in terms of like, well, I've been told for so long that if, this is God, this is how He is, and now I've got God saying that He's not that. But I was also told that if I believed anything other than this, then I'm a sinner, and that if anybody says anything other than this, then they're a liar, but that was definitely God. But this is what I was told, and that's what happens.
Yeah.
I've seen it happen.
Inconsistencies come up everywhere.
I've seen it happen. I've had to like walk people through this before, where it's like getting to know God in actuality versus getting to know the God that they were raised with. I remember one point having to talk to Jeremy about Hammer God,
What?
which was the idea that God is a wrathful, brutal, vengeful, petty creature who, like, you better not sin, otherwise you're gonna suffer a terrible life, and you're gonna get cancer and AIDS, and you're gonna die slowly and painfully, and that's what you deserve because you made a sin.
People like Job.
Right. So a lot of people believe that interpretation of God, which isn't true. It isn't Him. And yet people will pick apart the Bible to make that interpretation of Him be real, and then they'll preach it to each other because scaring people into being a Christian is apparently it's an acceptable thing for people in church who really value their numbers more than the depth of the relationships that people have with God. So there's a thing.
Yeah. Like, we tend to operate with like kind of this punishment and rewards type thinking
Yeah.
as people. So it's easy to like place that on God or deserving and undeserving
Yeah.
when it's not about either.
Yeah. So it
He
requires,
thinks a different way.
yeah.
So why is it so prevalent in today's Christian society? Because, like, you know, it's funny how I'm from a different state, and this teaching is so common, and it's not like it's, you know, a fluke thing. How do all these churches and stuff bastardize God, and God allows it to happen? You know,
That's a good question.
I wouldn't say God allows it to happen, but it is the kind of thing where it's why you see a lot of people leaving churches whenever they're faced with this, because something they know, like they know that something's wrong with it. We'll actually pause here so I can, and take a break and whatnot, so I can answer that.
No! Oh, God. That sucks.
Yes. I have one of the first things you search,
It's
something comes up called beefy.
blah, 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 blah.
again, I think the things.
I'm not even gonna cut this out.
Everybody shut up!
But notice, because Jeremy would be good and paying attention and things, we all were. The
Everybody shut up!
responsibility is on your shoulders.
No! No!
So that means if people get out of hand, it's his fault.
Delicious.
Anyways. So, pertaining to this whole discussion on desert seasons and what they mean and so on, you know, like I was saying, you know, when you look back, if you've been in a long one, oftentimes the important thing is to look back and find out why you were there in the first place, and even address that, and then whatever else has come with that. I know for myself, one of the things that I found myself having to do was to actually forgive God. Which, when I heard it, because basically what happened was I got kidnapped by a couple people from the church I was in at the time I was working in. And kidnapped is pretty apt, because I basically got invited out to, the one guy invited me out to his party because he was going to have a big prayer session, and it turned out to be just me, him, and one other guy. And they wanted to pray for me specifically.
Worst party ever.
Right? So basically what happened was they sat and they talked with me and prayed with me, and they told me that they felt like I needed to forgive God. And I just sat there, I'm like, that seems really wrong, because my more conservative Christian upbringing tells me that you can't forgive God. That's prideful. Well, their counter to that was simply this, that it wasn't about what was right and wrong, it was about what needed to happen for me to be able to grow past where I was at.
Yeah, it had to do with your emotions.
Exactly.
So like, even if somebody didn't do anything wrong to you, but you know you're offended by them, you have to forgive them in your heart.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. That's the gist of it.
It's actually worked for me too. Like, I took that and tried it.
Yeah. Yeah. So the thing that happened with that was, yeah, after spending that time, you know, I was able to finally let it go. Because one of the things was from like last week's hearing message, you know, sometimes our interpretation of somebody or something gets in the way of us being able to even hear from them. You know, like I was saying last week about how if you already have an interpretation of somebody's character and then they come up to you, say they're a liar, you've heard rumors all over the place that this person is a liar, you're going to be looking for them to lie to you. and what they might say to you may not even matter, because your perspective of them dictates the reality of who they are.
Mm-hmm.
So in this particular instance, God kept trying to talk to me about this thing, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't let him in. I just had nothing but anger and judgment and different things like that roiled around, because there were a lot of things about him, and especially personal choice, that I didn't understand.
Mm-hmm.
So the person who hurt me, they got to hurt me, and God had pushed me towards them, and I felt betrayed by that. So it ended up being this whole thing where when I took their advice and actually prayed that prayer and forgave, then I was able to finally find some freedom from it and even grow closer to God, learning more about who he is and so on. The point is like, I bring that up because sometimes it goes that far. Sometimes, when we've been in that season, it's come to a point. We always forget that the entire concept of being a follower of Jesus is to have a relationship with God, a personal relationship. That's what Jesus illustrated over and over and over again. That was his purpose before his death and resurrection and so on. He exemplified this very real aspect of life that's very important. And it's the thing that God's been trying for so long. But we just don't always value, or we can't always see it. So, that said, we come back to the point of this kind of season and what it's intended for. Like I said earlier, it ends up being about growing from one place. See, the thing of it is that this kind of season is meant to always be rather short. There's a timeline to it, unless we make a home there, or it's not even that, and we've just created a bad life for ourselves in this regard. It's only meant to be for that time. And the thing about it is like in the past, it was that these people were called into the wilderness. And the reason being is that when you're in the wilderness, you find yourself with a degree of solitude. And it's also a time when you can really have just a moment of peace. When we're surrounded by people or cities, just the din of everyday life, even in our modern day especially, we've got our phones and all the different distractions that are attached to those, computers, life, everything. And we go take camping trips because that gives us a chance to kind of disconnect from those things. Or, post them to social media. It just kind of depends on what kind of camper that you are. But the idea is that you'll still have those moments where you're like walking out there and being able to have a moment of just quiet. And see, it's in those moments of quiet when we can finally be hit with certain truths and revelations. It's when we can allow our thoughts to kind of go, and we can face certain things, understand certain things, see certain things a little bit more clearly, because we don't have everything blaring in our ears or kind of overrunning our minds. And a lot of that was the idea. So when people were called out to these places, they would have that time to just be with themselves and God. And they knew that they were going to come back, but it was still this particular thing. And I'm speaking purely of the individuals, like Paul and Jesus and so on. But this was kind of the purpose behind it, was that it pulled us out of places of distraction in order to hear, in order to deal with what's underneath the surface, what's going on, what's stopping that relationship from being there. And it also allows us to be in a more vulnerable state. Because one of the things about deep relationship is that they require vulnerability. Nobody develops a deep relationship with anybody based off of projections or lies. The strongest people that I've known, the people who project the strongest self-image, their relationships with people look like themselves, you know, getting to know these people really well, but these other people never really getting to know them very well because they don't care. Those people, the people that surround them, they're coming to those stronger types because they can latch onto them and they can draw from them. They can draw help, they can draw whatever they need. They're not actually invested in that stronger person though. What they're invested in is what they can get. And none of them would ever, like, it's not as malicious as it sounds. It's just that they're desperate and they need something and they need help, and that person can help them. And that's kind of the downside of that kind of relationship, is that it can be very, very one-sided in terms of like the depth and the knowledge of that. And for that stronger type, vulnerability may not even be an option, because the moment that you try to let down your shields, you're just met with more of their needs,
Yep.
which can be extremely difficult, especially in terms of wanting to be known as a person, wanting to be seen as a person, and wanting to occasionally be able to get help for yourself. So when it comes down to relationship with God, you know, I've had to get to know him in terms of his own being vulnerable, but I've also had to become more vulnerable as well, which is not always easy. And like I was saying earlier about the thing that he was kind of addressing with me and my comfort, you know, there are places where I'm not willing to be vulnerable because of that. So that ends up being the thing that he's trying to draw my attention to help him see, you know, this is a part of him, but because I'm not willing to see that right now, I'm not willing to tempt seeing that right now, and I want to just constantly kind of hold on to this for myself and be strong for myself. It's inhibiting our ability to grow deeper in relationship. The thing about these seasons is that they're intended to create opportunities for more vulnerability. And even to know that even when you are in a place, I mean, you look at the example of Jesus and how he not only went out there for 40 days and 40 nights, he fasted in that time as well. And at the end of it, he was pretty well, all it says is that after fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry.
Imagine that.
Imagine.
If they didn't say it, we wouldn't know it.
Right. But the point was just that, you know, when you've been out that long, you know, it puts you in a state of legitimate vulnerability and weakness. And being in the wilderness, you know, you're surrounded by things that are more dangerous than you. So it puts us in places where, yeah, there's something. And whether that's figurative or real, there's this thing where it's like we have to be able to know we're going to be vulnerable no matter what.
Yeah.
The circumstance is going to make us vulnerable. And as a result of that, you know, there's a place for us to learn that we can trust in God to carry us. And that's a portion of this. And that can be really hard to accept. And that can be really hard to live with, especially. Because some of us are not in that place. Like, I know for myself that vulnerability has always been a difficult thing. I spent so many years studying edible wild plants and how to hunt and fish and track and survivalism and all these different things in order to ensure that I was never vulnerable to any kind of calamity or any kind of thing like that. And even studying psychology was to learn other people better, so I didn't have to deal with my own ignorance of social situations and so on. because I wanted to be protected from those as well. So in all of that, it was everything that I could do in order to put forward the strongest front. So in that particular regard, you know, it's always been hard for me to finally like show up in front of God and be like, okay, we'll put the shields down. Because what I've learned over the years, what I've been taught since I was a little kid, was that shields are important to protect yourself. And if you have your shields down for a moment, somebody's going to take advantage of you and hurt you, and it doesn't matter how much they say that they're your friend and that they love you, they'll probably betray you. So, if that's what you're taught from a very, very young age, vulnerability is hard. But
so
at
you
the same,
kind of end up like, that's kind of when you get into like delusion. It's like, okay, so like me putting up a hard front has, you know, worked maybe once or twice in my life. I'm gonna go with that so that I have a possibility of being safe. But it's just a delusion, because like, how well can we really protect ourselves?
right. And yeah, that's the truth. Like, and even with that, it's the idea that it's going to protect you when in reality it inhibits you.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, I'm basically making a trade-off of either I'm really, really strong and able to like take care of myself, or I'm vulnerable to attack but able to have a relationship.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately you don't get both.
Yeah.
Like, the stronger your defense mechanisms, the harder it's going to be open with other people, to let other people into your life and your person and to be known.
Yeah.
And that's not different with God. It's why he'll take us to these places to be ministered to address this stuff. I always remember this thing that this pastor said one time that threw me when he said it, but I learned what it meant later. You need to be sure and keep an eye on your interpretation of God to make sure he's not smaller or bigger than he really is. And the smaller part I understood because I knew that a lot of people put God in a box. The bigger part I didn't understand until later, when I had to face the reality of how much he, for lack of a better way to put it, nerfs himself to let us live lives that we choose, to, you know, let us have the relationships that we want, to let us do what we tell him we want to do, or what we've told him we want to do, or whatever. Whether we've consciously told him I want this, or we've subconsciously told him by choosing it, despite the consequences or the pain it would cause. So, as a result of all that, he'll take us out into the desert and he'll show us those things in an attempt to draw us closer to him. Even just to let him have the opportunity, even for us to just let the shields down and actually let him address these things inside of us, and to help us grow, to help us become more than the quantum of what we're not. That's the point, though. It's always in order to develop that relationship, to deepen it, to grow closer. And that's what I got.